So we're just going to share a few words here in the large group and then go back to some more small groups. Um, for me, I feel like I graduated from college in 2008. I was, so full of hope. It was like the Obama year energy, hope and change, campaign, kind of energy was in the air. And I had spent time organizing at Notre Dame and really was convinced that institutions, could evolve. But then in 2009, when climate legislation collapsed in the Senate, I felt devastated. I felt like the environmental movement just didn't understand the power they were up against, and devastated by like the forces of, capital supremacy were stronger than our dreams for change. And so I committed myself to grassroots organizing, working with communities to build environmental and economic justice from the ground up. And as those years unfolded, I yearned for something more, a way to bring my spiritual life um, together with, my public life, that deeper alignment. And that's when Pope Francis published Laudato Si. And in that letter, I think he named the spiritual sickness at the heart of our ecological and economic crises, consumerism, the technocratic paradigm, the disconnection. And then in 2019, Francis wrote the letter to young economists and entrepreneurs, inviting us to bring that soul back to the economy of tomorrow. And in this context of this prayer group, Elizabeth, Colin, and I were all in together. I felt personally called, like Abuelo Francis, is reaching across the world to say, this is your time. Build workshops of hope. Be a protagonist of transformation. And I wasn't alone. There was tens of thousands of young people around the world saying yes to that invitation. And I almost, felt kind of ashamed because we were slower than many other countries in organizing, our Economy of Francesco chapter. And that's when Elizabeth, Colin, Sister Sue, myself, many of you here, Elias, really formed this Francesco collaborative to be a small part of that bigger movement, seeking to root our economic life in human dignity and not the forces that are concentrating wealth. So Francis's leadership taught me, a new way to lead. You know, One, we have to make time for those at the margins. Just even, every Holy Thursday, he washed the feet of those in prison. Even this past Holy Thursday, he was there in a prison. Are we visiting? Are we visiting the sacrifice zones? Are we visiting those most on the margins? Francis lived simply, right? He chose the guest house, not the papal palace. How are we living simply? Denouncing systems of injustice. His repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, I think, stands out to me. Speaking truth to power, while building these bridges of dialogue. Um, those pictures were striking, all the world leaders he met with. Elevating women and marginalized voices into decision making. I think most acutely through the Synod on Synodality and this past October, women really voting for the first time in this governance structure of our church, flattening hierarchies and inviting discernment. So in a world, overwhelmed by cynicism and violence, I think Pope Francis showed us that spiritual leadership must be both bold in vision and also tender and warm in practice. And so for me, I think that's the call. It's the call to be an ambassador of hope, to trust that if we sow faithfully, if we build patiently, if we dare to believe in a deeper belonging, a different kind of economy, a different kind of future is possible. And so that's the gift of purpose and courage that I'm so grateful for of Francis's legacy. Turn it over to you, Kelly.
Thanks so much for sharing, Felipe. Um, Gosh, I think this is an enormous prompt to summarize what Pope Francis has meant to me, to all of us. But I was just reflecting on a time in college. I had the delight of having um, our campus priest, Father Bob Beloin, who passed away, unfortunately, my senior year from cancer, kind of an unexpected diagnosis. But he just brought a warmth and charisma to his work on our campus. And Carrie Robinson had written an obituary about Father Bob. They were both very dear friends. And she wrote one line in there that said, Father Bob had a way of making everybody feel like they were his favorite. And I've never met Pope Francis, but that's how Pope Francis made me feel. That if I met Pope Francis, that he would make me feel like I was his favorite person in the world. And I think that he just had that magic of being able to see the best in whoever was right in front of him and give his entire time and attention to that person, like they were the most important person in the world. And that's how I feel about Pope Francis. I felt I think I'm feeling just an immense sense of loss because I feel like we were close, which is funny. I've seen him from a distance, never been in the same room as he was, but I think that he brought that warmth to the church and that just sense of knowing and seeing to the church. Um, I also think that he was a pope that just really lived an ethic of dignity. When I was coming out of college, I was pretty ravaged by the meritocracy, kind of had no philosophy of life, was just kind of in a wandering stage. And the first encyclical I've ever read was in graduate school, and it was Laudato Si, which is honestly a great encyclical to start off with for being your first. But it just really transformed my vision of what the good life is, what it means to be human, and also what it means to be a member of the Catholic Church. So I'm just grateful to Pope Francis too for I think really igniting Catholic social teaching for me and what that means for our lives, what that means for the church, what that means for the systems and structures that we build. Um, I also think he just had a way of showing us what it means to have your heart break for the world. I think he always just wore a posture of heartbreak on his sleeve. And for me, it was really, I think, that invitation to partake in the suffering of the world, to recognize that we're all part of the suffering of the world. Um, that also, I think, to me, is the whole message of the gospel. It's that heartbreak, that willingness to be broken. And I'm just grateful for his witness of heartbreak as well. Um, and then just finally, I mentioned his revolutionary spirit in our small group. Um, but I'm really reminded of Jesus's words that we very recently read on Good Friday, where he said, "My kingdom is not here. My kingdom is not of this world." And for me, Pope Francis embodied that. He was, I'm sure there have been other popes, but in my memory, as somebody who just lived simplicity, somebody who sought kind of the greater spirituality, the spiritual good of the church, the spiritual good of himself, he just really, I think, embodied that for me, that the kingdom, that this is not God's kingdom, that God's kingdom is not here. It is not of worldly power. It is not of money. It is not of all of the things that I think our economy kind of has us seek after. So I think that's what I'll be taking away is really his witness and his ethic that reminds us that God is higher and bigger than anything we can ever imagine, and that the things that we spend our time concerned about, that we're called, I think, into the vision of what's true and good and beautiful. And that Pope Francis had a good sense of that. And he invited us warmly as we are into that vision.
Thank you, Kelli. Colin?
Yeah, I'll just share very briefly. In our small group, some of us were reflecting back on when he first became Pope in 2013 and our experiences of that. And Chris mentioned something about just the different tone that he set and, and how important tone was throughout leadership and that tone of humility. Um, I was in the Middle East working with Jesuit Refugee Service at that time. Um, and and at that time, there wasn't like we weren't where we are today with such madness in the world. There was actually low point of conflicts in the world. But yeah, he met like shortly after becoming Pope, he met with my boss at the time, who was a Syrian Jesuit priest, and several other Syrian refugee colleagues of mine, and it was just like, all right, yeah, he's like he's coming down. He's like coming down to the ground floor. Um, I think the other reflection I want to share is just how much he influenced not just the Catholic world, but like the greater secular world. Sarah mentioned something of like how much he inspired many within the faith and with or outside of the faith. Um, and I was just struck a few days ago with like the front page of the New York Times was like basically we've lost our only moral global leader. It wasn't exactly that, but it was close to that. And it's interesting how um yeah, that's in climate, in migration, in a new wave. global economy. There wasn't really anybody else who was speaking out so honestly and boldly on this. And I think I don't know, it gave me the chills that Sarah just shared in our small group. This I wrote it down. It's like Pope Francis had to die so that more of us would come forth and use our voices. Right? It's like there's this inspired piece of all right, he's gone there. We have a lack of leadership. And so yeah, how are we good time to reflect. How are we called to fill that void?
My heart's really beating with those reflections. So many similar things come to mind. I was going back to the Pope Francis's book, Let Us Dream, because as some of you in the early Francesco collaborative days might remember, we used that book a lot. We always drew quotes from it. We wove it into our prayers. We used it in workshop prompts. And as I was going back to it, I was like, well, no wonder, because it's full of some really good stuff. And so I pulled out 3 quotes that I thought I would share with you today that to me, felt like medicine, as we reflect on his life. So here's the first one. A crisis can be a real help to know ourselves, for we can't escape from it unchanged. Either we come out better or we come out worse, but never the same. Pope Francis, I think, saw very clearly into the crises that we are in the midst of. I think he also led in a way that created a sense of crisis. There were ways in which he held his cards close to his chest, and he did things that were unexpected in accordance with Vatican protocol. And that was intentional because he was there to stir things up and he was there to help people see differently. And what this quote reminds me of is that we have a choice about how we come out on the other side. It's not guaranteed that things will be better, but we actually have a choice. I think what Pope Francis did for me is he constantly reminded so many of us to not be content with dreaming small, but urged us to dream really big. And there was a kind of emboldening that came from that invitation to dream big. So in 2017, I joined a meeting between Pope Francis and this project called the Economy of Communion that I had been involved with for many years. And I had just encountered a number of professional setbacks. And I think like all of us at various points was feeling just like an incredible amount of disillusionment. Like, does anything ever change? It's just like this kind of feeling really down. And the meeting with him happened to be on my birthday. And I remember just feeling like these words are going to sink into my bones and stay with me forever. And there he shared some really beautiful reflections about how a system that produces even one victim isn't a system built for communion. That in fact, we have to change the rules of the system so that there are no more victims. And to me, that is such a reminder that none of this is about our personal salvation alone. It is about our collective flourishing, that we are here to both transform and renew ourselves in our faith, but we are also here to transform and renew our systems, including the system of the economy. The second quote is this one. You have to go to the edges of existence if you want to see the world as it is. To me, what's always struck me about Francis is the way that he stirs our hearts through his gestures. He kind of enacted a lot of grand gestures that were rooted in tenderness. So, washing the feet of prisoners. I don't know if any of you remember in the pandemic when he stood alone in St. Peter's Square and it was raining and there was no one in the square. And he delivered this bold proclamation of solidarity with the world. To me, that image is just haunting. It reminds me that there are going to be times in our lives when we feel like no one's listening, but we still have something prophetic to offer. And then this is the last one. It's love is the engine of change, but not any love. It is a love that is political, a love that builds bridges and draws close to others in compassion and tenderness. So I think for me, when I consider the times that we're in, we're invited into a very bold kind of love. Like, we are not going to meet the signs of the times with a lackluster kind of love. It's a bold love that really reaches out and builds bridges. And I think that was actually among his last messages to the Economy of Francesco network. At the 5th anniversary this past fall, he wrote that love is what changes the economy, not efficiency, not productivity. It's love. So, thank you, everyone.